Yeah, I may look like I'm getting ready to enjoy a very relaxing vacation, and if you mismanage your fantasy football lineup the rest of the season, you may be joining me a little bit earlier than you would like to. So today's video is about breaking down some of the easiest and most difficult schedules to end the season. What do the fantasy playoffs look like for several different teams? Who should you invest in? Who should we be trading away? And an overall look at what the rest of the season will bring us. And to prepare for this video, I did some custom Google Docs that will be available only to our members, but you'll get a sneak peek at them today, talking about running backs and wide receivers. And these Google Docs detail every single game for the rest of the season, color coordinated to show you who has the easiest path and who has the most difficult path, not only to the fantasy playoffs, but fantasy championships as well. And first, let's talk about who will be on buys and when for the rest of the season. And this video is going to start taking a look at week 7. I'm going to leave out week 6 because when this video comes out on Saturday, we're only going to be a day away. And a lot of moves that you would be trying to make, whether it's trading for players or trading players away, aren't going to happen until after the week is over with anyway. So starting in week 7, we'll have 2 more teams on a bye. We'll have Baltimore and Buffalo. Week 8 will be Bye-Mageddon. There are 6 teams on a bye in week 8. Arizona, Detroit, Jacksonville, Las Vegas, the Los Angeles Rams, and the Seattle Seahawks. Then in week 9, we're back to only 4 teams. Cleveland, the Jets, Philadelphia, Tampa Bay. Week 10, 4 more teams. Cincinnati, Dallas, Kansas City, and Tennessee. Week 11, we're only at 2 teams at that point, so things will be a little easier. Indianapolis and New Orleans. In week 12, we've got Denver, the Chargers, Miami, and Washington. Week 13, we're going to take off because that's when all the Thanksgiving, Black Friday games, all of that will be happening. No buys that week. And then to finish the bye week schedule for the season in week 14, we've got Carolina, New England, the New York Giants, and San Francisco. I've got one really important note that we have to talk about, and it's checking your settings in your fantasy league to see when your fantasy playoffs actually start. Because if you cut out week 18, there is a solid chance that your fantasy playoffs may start in week 14. Now, they could end up waiting till 15 and go 15, 16, and 17, or if you're playing any type of 2-week matchups, or if a lot of teams make your playoffs, you could be starting in week 14. And if that happens, Carolina, New England, the Giants, and San Francisco are all going to be on a bye. When you take a look at Carolina, Chuba Hubbard, Ted McMillan. For New England, depending on if one of the running backs separates themselves by that point, that could be an issue. Drake May, Hunter Henry, Stephon Diggs. For the New York Giants, we could be missing either Cam Scatterbo, we could be missing Wan'Dale Robinson, Theo Johnson, Jackson Dart if you were using any of them. And then, of course, the big one in San Francisco would be Christian McCaffrey, potentially George Kittle, Jawan Jennings, Ricky Pearsall. There could be a lot of guys missing in week 14, so you need to check your league and see when your playoffs start. And like I said, today is just a sneak peek. If you want full access to all of these spreadsheets, then you got to become a member by hitting the join button down below. It's as little as $5 a month. You get access to our Discord. You get access to spreadsheets like this, behind the scenes videos that nobody else is seeing. Everything you need to be successful in fantasy football. But let's start talking about some guys that have some decent schedules to end the season. And for Chase Brown, it hasn't been a great start to 2025, but that doesn't mean that he can't finish strong now that they have Joe Flacco in tow as well. But as you take a look at the rest of the season schedule for him, he has got 4 matchups against teams that are currently inside the top 8 of most fantasy points per game allowed to the running back position. Now, he only has 1 matchup against a team that is in the bottom 8 of most fantasy points allowed. And when you take a look at his schedule, right before the fantasy playoffs and into the fantasy playoffs is when things will get really solid. Because he's going to have Baltimore for 2 games, and he's going to have Miami for another game as well. Week 13 through week 17 is going to be the bread and butter for Jamar Chase. At Baltimore, at Buffalo, they're in the top 16 of most fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. Baltimore again, at Miami, and then Arizona in the same conversation as Buffalo. Inside the top 16 most fantasy points allowed. Now, I don't want you to rely on this video as the only information to make decisions on whether or not to trade for or trade away a player. But this is definitely good information when it comes to helping you try to make that decision. And if you've been thinking about trading away Chase Brown, maybe the schedule that he faces down the stretch, especially the playoffs, will make you rethink that. Or maybe you're looking to buy low on a running back just to add some depth to your roster. Chase Brown could be had at a pretty decent price right now. Quinshon Judkins had a lot of questions at the very beginning of the season. We were not sure if we would even see him this year. But as soon as he stepped on the field, he's been a must-start fantasy running back every single week. Even in tougher games, he is still performing very well. And when you take a look at his schedule the rest of the season, he's got some really solid matchups. Quinshon Judkins the rest of the way has 5 matchups against teams that are in the top 8 most fantasy points per game allowed. He only has 1 matchup against a team, and that's going to be against New England in week 8, who's currently in the bottom 8 of most fantasy points per game allowed. So he really only has 1 very tough matchup left the rest of the way. When you take a look at the playoffs, that's where things get very interesting. And his best stretch of games left is from week 10 through 17, which is a really solid stretch. We've got 3 straight games against the New York Jets, the Baltimore Ravens, and Las Vegas. All 3 teams inside the top 16, most points allowed. Baltimore inside the top 8. A little bit of a tougher matchup in week 13 with San Francisco, but then heading into the playoffs, Tennessee, top 8, most allowed. At Chicago, top 8, most allowed. At home against Buffalo, they're in the top 16, most allowed. And then in your potential championship, it would be Pittsburgh. They're a little bit tougher. But getting there, Quinshon Judkins is going to be super solid. We'll touch on Josh Jacobs for just a second as well, because his schedule leading into the playoffs isn't fantastic. He does have a couple of good matchups against Philadelphia and the New York Giants, but it's the playoffs. It's the playoffs where Josh Jacobs could make his money for us this season. Because in week 14, he gets Chicago, top 8 most allowed. He goes to Denver in week 15. That could be a little bit tougher. That's going to be one where he might not have the best ceiling in the world. But then at Chicago in week 16, and then against Baltimore in week 17. Potential 3 matchups in the playoffs against teams inside the top 8, most fantasy points allowed. For as good as his playoff schedule looks, Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt looks even better. His last 4 weeks of the season at the New York Giants, against Philadelphia, against Dallas, at the Philadelphia Eagles again, all 4 of those games inside the top 8 most fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. Total, the rest of the way, he's got 6 matchups against teams inside the top 8 most allowed, and he's got 4 against those, like I said, at the very end of the season when it's going to matter most. As far as tough matchups go, he's got Detroit in week 10. They're in the bottom 8 of most fantasy points allowed, and his best stretch is going to be from weeks 14 through 18, because those 4 games I just talked about, but we're also going to add Minnesota in week 14 because they're inside the top 16 most fantasy points allowed. It is kind of awkward recording these Saturday shows because I have to do it showing my chubby the entire time. I'm not talking about my chubby from these matchup schedules right now. I'm talking about my shirt from Chubbies. So far this season, we have loved working with Chubbies, helping them launch their new NFL line. I've got my shirt on, Jake's got his, Taylor's got his, and I've already got a few pictures, very tasteful pictures, from members of Headliner Nation who went out to Chubbies, bought their shirts, and absolutely loved them as well. This thing is super freaking comfortable. Whether you want to wear it golfing, whether you want to wear it out to dinner with friends or whatever, these shirts are fantastic. And I'll be rocking mine on Sunday night as well when Detroit heads into Kansas City for an awesome Sunday night football game. But if you want to rock your favorite team as well, head on over to Chubbies or use the link down in the description below and use code HEADLINERS at checkout because you'll get $10 off of your purchase. But now a couple of running backs that their schedule the rest of the season definitely isn't going to give us any chubby. When I did my updated dynamic running back ratings for members earlier in the week, Kenneth Walker's numbers stood out to me because from an efficiency standpoint, he looks really solid right now. And if he would just get some more volume, he would have a super high ceiling every single week. Unfortunately, he's just missing out on some of those key touches. I was like, I can't give up on Kenneth Walker. Absolutely not. But then I looked at his schedule the rest of the way. And there is definitely some cause for concern, especially for him and Zach Charbonnet both. For the rest of the season, they've got 4 matchups against teams in the bottom 8 of most fantasy points per game allowed. Those are going to be some very tough matchups. Not only that, but 8 of their 11 games are teams inside the bottom 16 of most fantasy points allowed. It is a really tough stretch to end the season for Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet. Now, they're going to be at Tennessee and then at home against Minnesota in 12 and 13. Those are pretty solid matchups. But the rest of the way, at Atlanta in week 14, at home against Indianapolis in week 15, the LA Rams at home in week 16. All 3 of those teams, bottom 8, most fantasy points allowed. Then at Carolina and at San Francisco to end the year. They're in the bottom 16. People have already started losing faith in Kenneth Walker, not really because of the way he performs, but how he's being utilized by his team. And if that's enough to set you off, and now you're seeing this on the schedule, you might want to wait for a solid game or two and then think about making a move at that point. Tony Pollard is also one name that I have to mention real quick, and this is a guy that is a solid RB2 contributor. If you're starting him, you're probably playing him as your flex, and he's giving you more than enough points to be worthy of the flex every single week. But his ceiling could absolutely disappear the rest of the way. Week 7 through 11 is definitely going to be his toughest stretch of games the rest of the season. And that's why I'm saying his window may close sooner rather than later. He's got New England, at Indianapolis, and the LA Chargers before their bye in week 10. All 3 of those teams, bottom 8, most fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. But then they come back after the bye, and then they get Houston, who's also in the bottom 16. But then the playoffs have to be a concern as well, because in between that stretch in the playoffs, he gets Seattle and Jacksonville. Solid matchups against fantasy points right now. But then at Cleveland, at San Francisco, at home against Kansas City. Just a really tough stretch of games here to end the season, and because of that, Tony Pollard is going to potentially lose a ton of upside. And before we move on to some wide receivers, I just want to note that these spreadsheets for members will be updated a little bit later in the season, because things will change. We're only through 5 weeks right now, which gives us a really good base and a solid sample size of what some of these defenses will not only look like in the next couple of weeks, but maybe for the rest of the season. However, there's going to be some injuries. There's going to be defenses that maybe had a tough stretch to begin the season that get back on board through the midpoint of the season. For whatever reason it is, I'll get these updated here in the next few weeks. And then if you're looking at making some more changes still, or you need to know what things look like for the playoffs before your trade deadline, you'll get updated spreadsheets for members. And I'm going to do things backwards for wide receivers, and let's talk about the tougher schedules first. And New Orleans wide receivers have one of the worst stretches of schedules here at the end of the season. 5 games the rest of the way against teams inside the bottom 8 of most fantasy points per game allowed. 3 more games against teams in the bottom 16. In fact, week 10 through 16 is going to be very, very tough. Weeks 10 through 16 at Carolina, they're in red. Then they have the bye. At home against Atlanta, at Miami, both of them in red. At Tampa Bay, they're in orange. Carolina's in red. The New York Jets are in orange. From weeks 10 through week 16, they will not get a game against a defense that's currently allowing the top 16 most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. That is a brutal stretch. And it is a stretch that you might not even need to worry about the playoffs, because if you're worried about Chris Olave or Rashid Shaheed, you may have trouble even getting there. But here's the good news. Neither of these guys are must-start wide receivers. Chris Olave is a guy that's just on your bench. And even with these being tougher matchups, it doesn't mean that he still won't see 10-plus targets a game. So for me, Chris Olave is not a guy I'm looking at to start the rest of the season, but he's some decent bench depth that if you get into some trouble, if you have an injury, whatever it may be, maybe you could play a guy that you know that's going to get 8 to 10 targets a game. But for those of you that have been relying on Emeka Egbuka, or waiting for Mike Evans to come back, or feel like Chris Godwin could still give you fantasy value the rest of the season, I'm going to just warn you right now, I would turn the video off. Tampa Bay the rest of the season has 5 matchups against teams in the bottom 8 most fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. But that's not the most difficult thing to hear. It's that based on our value scoring for the playoffs, they have the hardest playoff matchups for any wide receivers in fantasy football, and it's not even close. For the value scoring that I've implemented on the spreadsheets that kind of give you an overall view of a score that dictates what the rest of the season looks like, it goes on a 1 to 4 scale. The lower the score, the easier the schedule. The higher the score, the harder the schedule. The Tampa Bay Bucks scored a 3.75 for their playoff matchups. There's only one other team that scored over 3, and it was the Kansas City Chiefs at 3.25. In Week 14, they have New Orleans. They're in the bottom 16. But then in the bottom 8, Atlanta, Carolina, Miami, and Carolina again. And things can change. And just because they have a really tough schedule to end the season doesn't mean that Tampa Bay isn't good enough to weather that storm. But holy cow, that is going to give you some apprehension at the end of the year. And if you want to keep Emeka Egbuka, if you want to keep Mike Evans, I totally get it. But you may want to just make sure that for the playoffs, you surround them with guys that have some good upside to help offset any floor issues you could have with them. For the Carolina Panthers, we're mostly focusing on Tet McMillan at this point. Now, it'll be interesting to see what happens with Coker the rest of the way, and whether Leggett is going to be a guy that will give you some touchdown upside the rest of the season as well. And when you take a look at their schedule, it's not extremely difficult, but it's still pretty hard. They've got 2 games against teams inside the bottom 8, which really doesn't jump off the page, but they have 8 other games against teams inside the bottom 16, and they have no games against any teams inside the top 8 right now. There is a lot of red and there is a lot of orange the rest of the season for the Carolina wide receivers. But what about some favorable matchups? The San Francisco 49ers could absolutely give us that at the wide receiver position. Now, I already talked about the bye potentially being an issue, and if your playoffs start in Week 14, San Francisco will be on a bye. Make sure you plan accordingly. But once they come back from that, or if your playoffs start in Week 15, you're going to get a couple of really solid matchups to start right away. Tennessee, at Indianapolis, and then Chicago for Week 17. 2 of those games, top 8 most fantasy points allowed, and then Chicago's inside the top 16 of most fantasy points allowed. That is a really solid 3-game stretch the rest of the way if you're thinking about using Ricky Pearsall or maybe even Jawan Jennings. And maybe we'll know a little bit more about Brandon Ayuk at that time as well. Minnesota's got a couple of stretches that are really favorable. When you take a look at weeks 9, 10, and 11 for them, we've got at Detroit, Baltimore, and Chicago. All of them are favorable matchups. Things will get a little tough right there in the middle at Green Bay, at Seattle, but then for the fantasy football playoffs, we'll be right back to it for Justin Jefferson or Jordan Addison at home against Washington, at Dallas, at the New York Giants, and then at home against Detroit. And what could be championship weekend for you? Justin Jefferson at home against Detroit could have a huge week. Minnesota is definitely one of the best investments right now based on their schedule. If you're looking for some hope for Brian Thomas Jr., there's still some really good opportunities because the rest of the season he has 5 games against teams inside the top 8 of most fantasy points allowed. Now, when you look at it, yeah, things could be a little bit difficult right in the middle of the playoffs. The New York Jets in Week 15, at Denver in Week 16. But on either side of that, he's got matchups at Tennessee, Indianapolis, 2 tough games there, at Indianapolis, at home against Tennessee. He's got a little bit of a sandwich there in terms of really solid games, tough games, really solid games again. So Brian Thomas Jr., for you the rest of the season, he may not be a guy that you lock in for those 2 weeks of the playoffs when they've got a tougher matchup, but before and for championship week, Brian Thomas Jr. could bring quite a bit of value. And I know there are a lot of Jamar Chase and T. Higgins owners out there that really hope Joe Flacco can help salvage the season for those guys. And it's the It's the schedule leading into the playoffs that I like. But once we get to the playoffs, we could have some issues because we have at Buffalo in week 14, at Miami in week 16. Now, those are two that I could see changing a little bit. And maybe towards the end of the season, those matchups don't look nearly as daunting as what they do right now. But they've got Pittsburgh coming up twice. Those are top 8 matchups. We're going to be at Baltimore, and then they're going to be at home against Baltimore right in the middle of the playoffs. Those are going to be. So we've got 4 matchups the rest of the way against 2 teams inside the top 8 of most fantasy points allowed. So while the playoffs could be a little bit iffy, at least we've got some really good matchups to help us get there. And Headliner Nation, hopefully this sneak peek helped you all try to make a decision on a few guys on your fantasy roster, whether or not you should hold on to them, whether or not you should be trading them, whether or not you should be buying low, and if you even give a crap about what the schedule says the rest of the way, because you got your guys and you're going to roll with them no matter what. But like I said, this tool available to our members is to help in the decision-making process. It's going to give you an overview of what the rest of the season looks like. Are you going to be dealing with a ton of buys one week? And if you are, what do the matchups look like for the rest of your wide receivers? This is a great complete overview of what you may need to do with your roster to not only make it into the playoffs, but secure another championship as well. But Headliner Nation, I hope you appreciated the video. Make sure you hit the like button for me. Subscribe if you're new to the channel. And if you don't have the bell notifications turned on, do it right now. So anytime we drop new content, you'll find out about it right away and you can hop right in there. Don't forget to become a member. Think about trying it out today if you haven't done so yet. As low as $5 a month. Access to our Discord, members only content, and a lot of these sheets that I talk about that you can get access to help you with your team are only available to members as well. Stay safe, Headliner Nation, and stay healthy, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.
Analytics off the chain, all the channels not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headliner Nation, we running the game.